Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, Emily. My name is W.E.B. As you know, I'm hosting this series of talks, mainly for graduate students, but also for the entire community. This talk is going to be on YouTube and will be available for all and as part of a series, now 12 talks on the history of academia in Israel, but all over the world as well. And today with us is Professor Emily J. Levine from the School of Education and the Department of History at Stanford University. She's associate professor there. And before, she was at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. She received her PhD and undergraduate, the BA degree from Yale. Also was there as a postdoctoral, Mellon postdoctoral fellow. She's the author of the Dreamland of Humanities, which came out with University of Chicago Press in 2013. Awarded a prize by the American Historical Association for the best book in European history from 1815 through the 20th century. So it's almost two centuries, and the competition was fierce. So congratulations, Emily. Very impressive. A new book that she will present today called Allies and Rivals, a German-American exchange and the rise of modern research university, was supported by fellowship from the National Humanities Center, but also from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. The book is forthcoming in the University of Chicago Press in the coming months. Was supposed to come out already, but we will be waiting for two more months or so. So Emily, thank you very much for being with us, and we are looking forward to hear you and to learn from you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm delighted for this early opportunity to present my book, which will be out in September. I had the privilege of spending July of 2013 in Jerusalem at the Leo Baeck Institute with Steve Asheim and friends there. And it was the last time I was in Israel. I was completing my research year on this book in Germany. So I hope to return in person soon. The title of my talk this morning is Johns Hopkins and the Transatlantic Origins of the Modern Research University. As David said, it's drawn from my new book, Allies and Rivals. This morning, I'll give you an overview of the book, its methodology and core arguments, including 3 conceptual frameworks that I offer and develop in the book as a way of thinking about the research university. I'll then do a deeper dive into the first of my cases so that you can get a better sense of the archives and sources I use and the stories that I tell. And then I'll offer some conclusions about how this work might be useful to not only to historians, but those working in adjacent fields and what the implications might be for today. So most studies of the university, I would argue, take either an internal or internalist perspective, focusing on the university ideal, or an institutional perspective, focusing on organizational issues. Part of the problem, I think, is that the university is part of the world of ideas, but it's also a world of hard compromises. And I turn this methodological bug into a feature. I understand the university not as a history of an ideal, but a history of compromises iterated over time by cultural brokers. So as such, Allies and Rivals bridges this internal-external divide, which I would argue is also a divide between the history of education and intellectual and political history. And I employ a mixed methodology, drawing as much on sociology, especially sociology of knowledge, but to a lesser degree, organizational sociology, as much as I draw on European and American history. It's based on 6 years of archival work in over 24 archives in Germany and America. So the book is archivally driven, transatlantic, which I'll talk about in a moment, interdisciplinary, and I hope resonant to you. Over the course of the 19th century, nearly 10,000 Americans went to study in Germany. The traditional story is that Americans imported the German research university to America, but the archives reveal a more complicated story. In 1882, the physiologist and permanent secretary of the Prussian Academy of Sciences, Émile de Bois-Reymond, he reflected a newfound interest in America when he linked America's industrial progress to its scholarly output. And here you see his speech excerpted on the slide, in which he writes about what he called the center of gravity. And he says the center of gravity of a binary star, right, in economics has already moved westward. And he anticipates that the scholarly center of gravity will also move more decisively towards the west. And de Bois-Reymond joined a growing number of Germans who implored their compatriots to take America more seriously. The French too showed greater interest in the American version of Göttingen rather than Göttingen itself. Now, what the Americans were interested in was pure research. This is what Stephen Turner once called the research imperative. But these American so-called returnees did not just study abroad. They converted their experiences abroad into educational reform at home, enshrining the commitment to pure research in their new institutions in the US. 15 of the 150 Americans who studied at Göttingen became US university presidents, and another 30 can be traced to the University of Leipzig. When one American sojourner, Daniel Coit Gilman, founded Johns Hopkins University in 1876 as the first modern research university in America, it was fittingly called Göttingen at Baltimore. But Gilman and other Americans didn't just import the German graduate school. They created a hybrid institution, and their hybrid version, which combined the English model with the German Ph.D., would be emulated the world over. A German Austrian philologist quoted in 1907, he put it differently. He said, "The American Research University is the best conquest that we have made in the world since Goethe." Because for Germans, this imitation was flattering, but it was also threatening. And in my early research in the Prussian state archives, I was surprised to find that already by 1900, Prussian reformers were citing the declining number of American students as a potential threat to what they called the international reputation of German science. And they began sending Germans to learn from the US version of the German university. And it turns out that their anxieties were justified. So if we fast forward over 100 years, now we see the same Humboldt University adorned with the English phrase, excellence in research and teaching, competing for the excellence initiative, an elite system that, of course, many policy experts have identified as the German attempt to recreate the American Ivy League. So my research questions for this project were, how did this happen? How did American academic innovators overtake the Germans and their leading institutions? How did this institutional cross-pollination actually work? How does a place go from being a receiver of knowledge to a producer of it? Stuck. Okay. So Allies and Rivals is the first book to consider the rise of the modern research university through this bidirectional exchange among Germans and Americans. I take transatlantic exchange as the topic, methodology, and causal historical mechanism. And I focus on a network of reformers who cooperated and competed across Germany and the US to found and then iterate higher education in their respective cities. And I use pairs of scholars and institutions throughout the book to convey this two-way exchange, including formal professorial exchanges like the German-American Exchange founded in 1905, which was anointed with imperial pomp. Here you see Kaiser Wilhelm II and Empress Augusta Victoria joining the inaugural lectures of the new Roosevelt Exchange professors in 1914. Other exchanges were more implicit, as in the case of Andrew Carnegie and the Kaiser, here in which I examine the way that private money influenced the reorganization of scholarship in the first decade of the 20th century, with the parallel foundings of the Carnegie Institution in Washington, DC, and the Kaiser Wilhelm Society that spawned the Max Planck Institutes in 1911. In all of these cases, I use bidirectional exchange among individuals to tell a story about these belated empires, Germany and America, their ambitions for Weltpolitik and world power, their relationships as partners in social science, and rivals in politics in an increasingly connected world. And there are several frameworks that are helpful for understanding this exchange and the diffusion of ideas. And I draw on many of these, including among them coopetition, coming from the language of economics and game theory. There's the traditional diplomatic history of Paul Kennedy and others in the cooperative and competitive dynamics of diplomacy. And then for me, probably the most important, coming from literary history and through cultural history, the history of transfer, or as the Germans call it, transatlantische Geschichte, or l'histoire croisée, right? And here, I mean that transatlantic exchange that often yielded these hybridizations. And it's a combination of these frameworks, no one is exactly correct, that helps to convey the unique relationships that encompass the individual relationships and the independent value system of the university, including its lives, its ideas, and institutions. So as such, Allies and Rivals tells us something not only then about the ascent of these countries in the late 19th and early 20th century, I argue that it also contains universal lessons about how ideas spread and institutional innovation occurs. So the book's core argument then is that the transatlantic frame helps us. In fact, it's required to see those universal lessons. And it offers three frameworks that help us understand what makes the university unique. And here are the three core arguments. So the first argument is that academic innovation happens through what I call competitive emulation. So that's my term drawing on those other frameworks that I just mentioned, this unique competitive cooperative dynamic among universities at the local, national, and international levels. And this competitive emulation results in institutional hybridization, this term that I draw on from sociology. The combination of previous institutions, often with a new competitive idea. And three, this wouldn't happen without individuals, right? So this is not just a structural history in my telling, it's negotiated by agents, cultural brokers, academic innovators who negotiate academic social contracts with different partners, often balancing national and local needs and iterating them over time. And then what I hope to show over the course of these different frameworks which operate across different axes is that the university is shaped by the development of the nation state and the global market, but in its commitment to sharing ideas and its dependence on peer institutions for validation, it also diverges and continues to diverge from these forces. We'll say more about that at the end. So now I'm going to go into some of the sources, and I'll do a deeper dive of the first of the sort of the opening case of the book that should give you an example of the kinds of archives and sources I use, and this interdisciplinary transatlantic frame and some of its findings. So what my subjects were interested in, as I mentioned, is the modern research university, the institution, in my telling, the University of Berlin. It was designed, among others, by Wilhelm von Humboldt in 1810, though not the chief source of its features, certainly the best synthesizer of that vision, sometimes called the Humboldt ideal as a result. And I understand in this series, you've also heard from Johann Östling and Mitchell Ash's important work, which shines much light on that ideal and its various contours over time. Of course, that ideal would be multifaceted with many components, and it has a complicated history. As they show, it doesn't actually get solidified until the late 19th century. In my work, I argue this was less an ideal and more of a compromise, or what I call an academic social contract, in which the new university receives an unprecedented amount of autonomy in exchange for services to that society. Now, as we know, the Prussian state had been defeated by Napoleon, and amidst the emerging German nationalism, this newly reformed medieval institution that was created would be unique in its combination of both advancing knowledge or research with disseminating knowledge or teaching. So this combination is itself a hybrid, and it proved useful and powerful beyond the German lands, and it would soon be iterated, not just imported by the Americans. And critical to that transformation was a man by the name of Daniel Coit-Gilman, whom I'm calling the first academic innovator. So uniquely in American higher education, Gilman understood the need to acquire knowledge from elsewhere. As Abraham Flexner, the next academic innovator, we might say, said, in order to know what to avoid and what to abandon, what to test and what to adopt. Flexner would make Gilman his role model and declare, quote, "No other American of his day had a comparable equipment and knowledge of coming educational change or experience with innovation," end quote. Gilman was born in 1831 to descendants of the founders of Norwich, Connecticut, and he begins his career in New England cataloging the library of George Washington. In 1854, he has the chance to travel to Europe with a delegation to an American delegation to St. Petersburg, together with his classmate Andrew Dixon White. And Gilman confides to Noah Porter on that trip, who would go on to become the Yale professor, next Yale president and representative of the Old Guard. Gilman says, quote, "When I go home to America, I must have definite notions. I long for an opportunity to influence New England minds." And what I want to emphasize is that Gilman thought of himself as a self-described close observer of three typical institutions of his day: the residential college, the technical school, and the research university. And as such, I think he was poised to define the purpose of higher education learning in post-Civil War America. And you could say it took him 3 attempts on these three different institutions to get it right. But those failures and their different iterations tells us something about institutional innovation. So his first attempt was at Yale, where he took a job with Yale's library, and he became involved in reorganizing the emerging scientific school, which when he was in Europe had added courses in chemistry and engineering. And he very quickly shows his savvy fundraising skills, as well as his institutional farsightedness in this so-called proposed plan for a complete organization of the School of Science connected with Yale College. And this is a document in Yale University's manuscripts and archives, in which he writes, "For a long time past, every European government has made provision for the thorough training of men who wish to study science for its own sake." And he goes to talk about various practical fields, actually, in which this pure science is relevant. And then he says, we are consequently far behind European nations in many important branches of industry. And in fact, in an appendix to this document, he then goes ahead and lists dozens of these institutions in Prussia, but also France and elsewhere, where they're already doing these technical have founded these technical institutions. And for Gilman, these nascent institutions require guidance in America. And he writes a series of articles in which he expresses admiration, in particular for those in Prussia, and suggesting that sort of Germany is model, right? We regard it as highly important that the scientific schools of Europe should be understood in this country. America was still pupil to Europe's teacher. Yet, Europe, of course, also represents the competition, and concerns Gilman raised about German competition were crucial to Gilman's appeal to the Yale Corporation, to, quote, retain in this country young men, and especially students of science who now resort to German universities, right? If we don't get our act together, we're going to constantly be losing our kids to Germany and to Europe. So Germany is both symbol of for emulation as well as part of this new global competition. And as a result of this leadership, Gilman secures in 1816 a building and a benefaction in the amount of $100,000. The largest benefaction to date was only $50,000. And they named the school in honor of the primary donor, Joseph E. Sheffield. And this new Sheffield Scientific School receives the right to grant the German Ph.D., the first in America, the first of that degree awarded in America. And Yale quickly gains a stronghold over this Ph.D. market in America. Gilman's named professor of physical geography, but his passion lies really for innovation. And he feels like he's brought Yale's English college as far as it could go. Fortunately for Gilman, he gets a second chance. And so he moves on to his second attempt to perfect his vision for the pure and applied sciences at a new institution where he can bring this together, the College of California, which opens in Oakland in 1860. It was, according to the religious historian George M. Marsden, the Yale of the West. Its most valuable asset was land nearby named Berkeley for Bishop George Berkeley, the 18th century philosopher. And over the course of the 1860s, it secularizes, it modernizes, it gets a land grant as part of the 1862 Morrill Act, that is money from the sale of lands in exchange for the commitment to teach the agricultural and mechanical arts. Gilman is offered the position of the presidency twice, actually. He finally accepts in 1870. He throws himself into becoming a native Californian. And to a certain degree, he's successful. He lectures on geography. He gets up to the Board of Regents, which advises the school. He negotiates with legislators and tries to create an institution that reflects the needs of its constituents. And I think his sensitivity to these specific challenge is evident in his inaugural address as president, which I've excerpted here. And in the address, he actually says the University of California is not the University of Berlin or of New Haven, which we are to copy, but it is the university of this state. It is not the foundation of an ecclesiastical body, nor of private individuals. It is of the people and for the people. And therein also lay its challenges. He was unable ultimately to bring all these different opposing camps together, the ecclesiastical and the secular, the scientific and the applied. Anti-intellectualism was strong. They perceived Gilman as an elitist, and a new political code was passed, narrowing his executive latitude. He complains to his friend, Andrew Dixon White, who was now the president of Cornell and facing similar challenges as in that private public institution, as a debate was emerging about who should control education in the US. Was it a public institution? Was it a religious one? Was it a state one? And in his third attempt, Gilman would get the chance to try out his innovation on the newest model, and that was the privately funded institution. The offer came in 1874 from an industrialist and philanthropist, Johns Hopkins, in an emerging port city, Baltimore. Uniquely, it offered him the chance to lead a new university with a fund of $3.5 million. So I just said 100,000 was previously the highest benefaction. So this is like in a completely different league. And there's another $3.5 million reserved just for the hospital. And what's more is that the president of the board emphasized that this institution would be non-denominational and freed from all sectional bias, entirely plastic in the hands of those to whom its founder has entrusted, right? So that's a tremendous amount of unprecedented autonomy. And as you can see from his reply on the right side, Gilman could hardly contain his delight, right? He says essentially, where do I sign? When I think of the immense fund I would have at my disposal, I'm ready to say, I am at your disposal. So he begins almost immediately to hash out his ambitions and to broker compromises from which we will get the hybrid that is Johns Hopkins. On the day he accepted the offer, he writes to his friend George Brush at Sheffield, I'm inclined more and more to believe that what is wanted in Baltimore is not a scientific school, nor a classical college, nor both combined, but a faculty of medicine and a faculty of philosophy. And so he's starting to kind of put back together these different elements, right? It will be both and it will have also a certain amount of autonomy, each of the different pieces to it. Of course, an important part of the German research university. But Gilman doesn't get everything that he wants. And he is, however, a skillful negotiator. And this is one of the key features of the successful entrepreneur, beginning with Humboldt and going all the way up through Clark Kerr. And I'll bring 5 features to your attention that come out of these negotiations that are some of the more fascinating archives to read, I think, in Johns Hopkins University library. When Gilman lays out his vision for a world-class institution to the board, he suggests doing away with the undergraduates altogether. In fact, he's not all that nice about them. He's fairly condescending about them. But a journalist gets a hold of his words, publishes them, and a scandal ensues in Baltimore. The moneyed men of Baltimore don't really care for having a lofty world-class institution that doesn't serve the needs of educating their sons. Gilman, if he had it his way, would have done away with the BA altogether. He didn't think that it was worth his time. But if Gilman were to be successful, he realized quickly, as a result of this near scandal, that he would need to persuade Baltimore citizens, who were in effect his new contracting partners, of the connection between their city's needs and the institution's lofty ambitions. And so to that end, the president of the board advises Gilman to consider the so-called double aspect of higher education. That is, to not only offer the PhD, but also the American BA. He also introduces this element of funding graduate student fellowships, another kind of hybrid between the English model and the German one. He emphasizes freedom or autonomy for department heads. And he focuses on men, not buildings. So rejecting a plot of land outside of the city, as Jefferson had done with his academical village, but building instead the university into the fabric of the city, much more in the way that the Germans had done in Göttingen and elsewhere. He goes off on a recruiting mission to recruit young men of genius, learning, and talent, since as one confidant warned him, old men who are great, these you can rarely move. And in particular, he goes after untapped and unrecognized talent, right? So he goes up to West Point, recruiting his first faculty member, Henry Rowland, a young promising American physicist and quintessential undiscovered talent. And as he goes off to the UK, recruiting professors there, including most notably the mathematician James Joseph Sylvester, who couldn't get a job at Oxford or Cambridge, despite being recognized around the world as one of the leading mathematicians because he was a Jew. So if Hopkins, however, was to compete internationally, Gilman knew that he would need to have the validation of its peers, and he identifies publishing as one route to that status. And he encourages the founding of several foundational journals, and that becomes key to his emerging strategy. But in order to be truly international and recognized, he would need to recruit German scholars. And in this area, he was less successful. And that he failed in this regard in general, and also in particular, to recruit a German to Sylvester's replacement when Sylvester finally gets his due to go back to Oxford at the end of his life, tells us something, I think, about this system of exchange. And this is the last figure I'll speak about in this story. The German that he tries to recruit was Felix Klein. He was a Jewish German mathematician born in Dusseldorf in 1849. He receives his doctorate in Bonn when he's only 19. He's appointed ordinarius professor in 1872 at the age of 23 at the University of Erlangen, perhaps the youngest German professor of math. For his famous inaugural speech on geometry, later known simply as the Erlangen program. Klein goes on to Munich and then University of Leipzig on the search for finding a place where he can start his own mathematical school. And he would end up in Göttingen, where he would stay for 27 years and build up a major center of applied mathematics that would become associated with David Hilbert and others. But he also had a number of health and mental health problems. The competition that he had experienced with Poincaré had led to a nervous breakdown, and his career as a mathematician was basically over by 1883. And it's the end of that year that Gilman reaches out to him in search of echt Germans for his cause, offering him a position at Baltimore. But given that his mathematical career was basically over, what likely caught Gilman's eye was his organizational talent. And the 34-year-old Klein responds in 1883. It seems that he's interested in the offer. He says, I'm inclined to accept the position. I'm attracted by the novelty of the task and the grandeur of the perspective. And it seems as if he's leaning towards going. But in other correspondence, he expresses frustration with his knowledge that Sylvester had made more money than he was being offered, and that as Germany was increasingly guaranteeing financial support for widows and orphans in the event of a professor's death, Hopkins in America would not provide a similar guarantee until the early 20th century, exposing, I think, a liability in this new private university model and its ability to recruit abroad. Though he was tempted that he would have a journal and freedom, Klein ultimately declines the offer. And I think the correspondence between Klein and his fellow students reveals that this decision rested on Hopkins's perceived vulnerability as an institution. He consults a number of students who say, the seminar system in America is already unmoored from the German example. And though the students are good, Hopkins was still an entrepreneurial upstart that might fail. Klein, of course, as I said, did go on to create a school of mathematics. It just wasn't in Baltimore. It was in Göttingen. Though he would use American-style fundraising to raise money for his semi-private Göttingen Association for the promotion of applied physics and mathematics. Despite his not going to work in the US, he traveled to the US twice in the 1890s, and American students came to him, in particular female American students to whom he was open, and he trained a whole generation of American mathematicians, spurring a new field in applied math and actuarial science. So attracting Germans to America was a critical piece of the American university's ascent in the international scene. And Hermann Fonholtz, the preeminent German historian of America in his day, also declined a job offer at Hopkins. It would be another 15 years before this situation changed. President Harper offered a job to Holst at the newly founded University of Chicago in 1890, and he accepted, paving the path for others. And with Stanford University, founded in 1885 with its German motto, now American versions of German universities had begun to take hold. In fact, the competition by the 1890s is less with Germany than within America in order to create the best American version of the German universities, and Germans took note. According to a German instructor in the new field of applied psychology, Hugo Münsterberg, if a former rector, Holst, found it worthwhile, then the youngest instructor might risk it, and he left for Harvard shortly thereafter, and the stream of scholars begins to flow in the opposite direction. In 1904, we have sort of a tipping point in which a number of German scholars travel to St. Louis for the World's Fair, many of whom arrive skeptical, like Karl Lamprecht, the cultural historian, but leave interested in American innovations in higher education, including women's education, the private financing of scholarship, and new campus architecture. And while these Germans, like Felix Klein, did not remain and work in America, they took these American innovations willingly and eagerly back. Lamprecht, in particular, was interested in the new kind of American campus, which he tried to fundraise for and create in Leipzig to give Leipzig a leg up on Berlin. So where we stand then by 1910 is I think, a different center of gravity about which Du Bois Reymond spoke. is now shifted, right? And you can see in a way how this anticipates scholarship today, in which historians of science and sociologists of knowledge have argued about how we trace center of gravity. Is it by publications? Is it by languages in which those publications are printed? And I think that if we look back at the early 20th century, that perspective that looks different, that center of gravity, depending on the perspective. Arguably, on the domestic front in the US, Johns Hopkins already by 1910 was lost in a victim of its own success, lost in a sea of domestic copycats like Chicago and Stanford, which had already surpassed it. From the international perspective, however, now this great diversity of institutions had created a very robust system that made the US formidable and a contender with which Germany could no longer ignore. And if we follow the story around the corner, we see that by 1910, 1911, when the Kaiser Wilhelm Society is founded and its institutions effectively removing research from the German university, the American university is now already in ascent. But we learn something from these bidirectional exchanges that's more important than who's going up and who's going down. Gilman, for his part, knew that he could only achieve his aspirations for Hopkins if diplomas rose beyond fiat to be, quote, worth their face in the currency of the world, as he said. Degrees from the new institution had to be accepted by esteemed Germans as evidence of excellence in training and scholarship. Conversely, the German universities could remain preeminent, the Germans understood, only if their professors were sought by foreigners for training. So if I offer three conclusions, then I would say the first takeaway from this story and other stories like it in this book is also an irony, right? It's that an institution needs their potential rivals to advance ideas and create institutional innovation. But that rivalry then also raises the stakes of that very exchange. Second, German and American academics depended on one another in a fundamental way to validate each other's institutions and to advance knowledge. And this relational quality of scholarly validation sets universities apart from the values of nations and the values of markets. And finally, I think this has consequences for today. Exchanges among Germans and American academics helped shape today's universities, but they also exemplify a universal process of the vicissitudes of knowledge centers, what Joseph Ben David and others have referred to as the life cycle of knowledge. The life cycle is a dynamic process that's both institutional and geographic. In Berlin today, it's common to hear with a sign of regret that the German university found its true home in America. But an analysis that focuses on the ascendancy of American higher education misses the point, because decades from now, we'll be analyzing the rise of institutions that won't be American. Maybe they'll be Chinese, maybe they'll be Israeli. We don't know. What will hold true is that the history of higher education is shaped by innovators wrangling their communities and balancing national imperatives and professional gain with universalist ideals and pursuit of truths. Knowledge centers like nations rise and fall, but they do not operate by the logic of nations or markets. Knowledge advances most rapidly among those who are open to the free exchange of ideas, and that's the essential lesson of this history. Thank you. Toda rabba.
Toda rabba, Emily. Thank you very much for fascinating talk. And I will open the floor for questions. I see Lutz is hand, and then Justin. So Lutz, you are first, please. You are muted, so please unmute yourself.
David, I was just applauding. And
applauding. Okay. So this is Justin. This is the same with you, or you want to
yes,
go?
But of course I can ask a question.
Yeah. Well, please go because.
Okay.
Yeah. Please.
Emily, thank you so much for this talk. I've been looking forward to your book for a while now. I've read your earlier work, impressive and needed, much needed to get beyond sort of the nation state containers that are so dominant in so much scholarship. You speak a lot about the center of gravity, and also, of course, we know that we're living in an era of exploration where perhaps the locality or the spatiality matters and less. And yet your history makes very clear that it's still about these exchanges take place in a certain environment, and there's a lot of the importance of mobility. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the extent to which you think, based on what you've learned from this transatlantic exchange and the relationships over actually many decades, to what extent this is still the kind of collaborative effort and the kind of exchange, diffusion of ideas we are facing today, and shifting the center of gravity more towards Asia.
Thank you so much, Justin. Sorry, it's a little hard to hear you. We're going in and out, but it's so nice to meet you in person as well. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes, I've been looking forward to meeting you in person. I'm an admirer of your work and your articles and Minerva. Yes, it's great to see you. And thank you for the question about the center of gravity. I think you're right. It's an interesting transition point that we're at now. I mean, I think one, especially as we sit over Zoom and have this conversation, might be tempted to say, place doesn't matter. These are universities of everywhere. Look at us, we're transcending borders. It's so easy. But of course, we know that that's only part of the story. I mean, on the other hand, we are seeing a moment at which we're seeing the rise of nationalist rhetoric everywhere, challenges to open exchange, the exclusive protectionist nationalist position on science also being an obstacle to that very open exchange. Luckily, I think we overcame that in the fight, for example, to find a vaccine. But I think that watching the sort of values of science battle the nationalist rhetoric in various places and continue to battle various places, I think is an expression of precisely that tension. So, I mean, for me, I think that if universities were just global institutions, it would be simple. We would say sort of follow the pure values of science, but that's not the case. I mean, I think my story has tried to show that, in fact, the university has emerged with these dual loyalties that are very real. And we see that today too. Universities in America receive most of their funding from the federal government. They are institutions of the federal government. We sort of forget that, even the private ones. So we can't simply rebuff the nation state, but we also can't be limited by it. So I think one of the sort of challenges for, I think, visionary leaders and leaders up to the task today is to know when to invoke which side of the equation. And I think in our current world, in which truly global institutions are dwindling, it's my feeling that universities have a unique and special mandate to invoke that global commitment to our shared humanity and to the sort of values of science. So, I mean, I think that's one answer to your question. And the other answer of your question, I think, about Asia, and higher education, perhaps, it changes whether you're talking about teaching and research. But I think that with respect to research, I think that is where the goals and the responsibilities of universities all over the world should be.
Thank you, Emily. I have a question.
Thank you.
And, if others want to follow up, please don't be shy. So my question to you relates to my my passion for graduate schools. And I have a passion not for the PhD as such, but the graduate school as academic innovation, which exists in the US for many years now, but was not transferred back to the continent, to the European continent, also not to Israel. And we have a PhD programs that are not comparable to the US. And I think it's right. This is also the case to continental Europe, even to the elite British universities. I'm not speaking about the talent and sometimes the excellence. I'm saying about the institutions. And I wonder if you have kind of insights to share why we failed to establish graduate schools, American-style graduate schools, and why the issue is not even on the agenda, not in the center of the academic agenda or public agenda. Did it ever occur to you that this is a problem?
It sounds like you're asking why it is that the training of graduate students is not something that's valued sort of in various
we don't have a school. We have it's not a program.
Yeah.
There is no fellowships, not structured long-term fellowships, not special courses. The MA programs are booming because we are budgeted on numbers, and the quality of the MA training is not equivalent to the graduate school in the United States.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one of the problems with these institutional hybrids, like the Modern Research University, right, which, as I said from the outset, combines research and teaching, right? I mean, we think of that as self-evident today. That is our institution, but there was nothing self-evident about it. It was a creation of its moment that I think lasted in some ways much longer than anyone anticipated. And I think one of the stories that I tell over the course of the book is that if we begin with the institutional hybrid that combines research and teaching, but almost as soon as it's created, there are expressions of frustrations, much like the one you are making right now, that in fact, these don't go very well together, and that you always are shortchanging one of those, right? Whether it's that you're focusing on teaching and so you're not doing excellent enough research, or you're focusing on the excellence of research and so you're shortchanging your pedagogy and your training and your mentoring. And so very quickly after, in each of these moments, in frustration at the inability to, I think, meet the needs of one or other of these tasks, you get the creation of new institutions to fulfill one or more of those responsibilities. So one of those moments is, of course, in 1910 that I mentioned, 1911, with the creation of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society and the Max Planck Institutes, which said, we're just going to take research out of the institution. And Justin, you know, you've written about this, and it's a fascinating story. And the jury's kind of still out on whether or not this is, I would say, you know, is this the more productive option, right? To just create institutions that are just for research and leave the teaching to other scholars in the institution. And, you know, there were Germans at the time who worried that this would make the universities second-class places precisely because of the value system that you describe, right? And you get, if you look at this sort of over the longue durée, you see, you know, in America in the 1920s, this I would say, kind of pushing back against the German Research University and the revitalization of the English College in the form of the liberal arts. And this is the great moment of the founding of Bennington and Reed and Black Mountain College. You know, these were places with scholars, but who wanted to bring back mentoring, bring back training, bring back teaching as the heart of what we do, right? And then again, with 1933 and the founding of the Institute for Advanced Study, you have Flexner throwing up his hands and saying, you know, the university has gone astray. We're department stores of teaching. We're just filling people's heads, you know, to mix metaphors, to use Ferreri's metaphor, you know, we're piggy banks of knowledge, right? And so we need to go back to creating just institutions of research. So, I mean, the longue durée, I think, shows this kind of pendulum swinging back and forth. And I think that in moments of intense frustration, like the ones you described, I think, you know, the hope is that we will see innovations that step in to pull, in particular, that training that you're talking about out of the university and take it elsewhere. And I don't want to be so Pollyannish to say that, you know, that I see that sort of that I'm optimistic about so many of those institutions. You know, many innovations fail, but many more don't. Many, you know, a few don't, and those are the ones, of course, that we sit here and we're talking about, like Johns Hopkins. So, you know, I think I would say that I hope that we'll see in the coming years, also following 2020, you know, and the great kind of shock that has done to the system, new institutions and hybridizations, hopefully that will address the kinds of concerns that you're talking about.
Thank you very much. This is the second time today that I hear the name of Abraham Flexner. I think this is the same Flexner as we are both speaking about. The first time this
indeed.
morning was from the head of the Australian National Rural Health Commissioner, and she was speaking about the role of Abraham Flexner in retraining physicians.
Exactly.
And bringing them from training really model to the university and making them academics. And she was mentioning it also because of the limits of this model, because the academic training created a distance between the new physicians and the rural population and their need. Right. But so maybe can you extend on his role and his figure, sure. And what does it do? Where does it come to the American education system?
Flexner's a fascinating figure, and he's a very important figure for the book. He's also a Jewish American who goes to Germany and models much of the professionalization and institutionalization of American institutions on Germany. I mean, the story that you're describing, which is the professionalization of medicine, I tell in chapter 5 of my book, and it is really becomes the model for the professions at large. And it's a fascinating story because he is called in with no experience in medicine, but very much a generalist and experience in professionalization to survey the state of medical schools. And as you know, what he finds is not good, right? They're all privately run. There's no standards. You don't need a BA to go to medical school, right? There's all these like very amusing and not so amusing stories that you find in the archives of the Library of Congress on his note cards that he took from these different rural institutions, you know, cheat charts that there were no instruments and so forth. So, I mean, they published this report and it's absolutely damning, right? And the heads of these hospitals are not laughing at all, but they are embarrassed essentially into standardizing. And it's this remarkable instance where he, through exposing the shortcomings, he creates this tremendous peer pressure and this need, the urgency to elevate standards, and basically is able to push this industry towards moving towards requirements for entrance, including the BA, longer periods of training. He also develops this split, as you were saying, clinical and research model, and completely transforms medicine. Now, it does have its drawbacks. And at the time, many were critiquing its undemocratic elements. After all, not all institutions would be able to standardize. Not all would have the money to do so. And you know, his defense was to say, well, do we really want bad doctors or untrained doctors treating us as well? But you know, what happened was probably what we expected, which was that, you know, it was the Black schools and it was the rural schools that weren't able to meet those standards, and those would, you know, wither away. And so we ended up sort of with this decentralization of doctors in a more kind of unequal field, as the excellence standards were raised and not all of the institutions were able to reach them. And you could say that becomes then the model then for the other professions, and a really powerful metaphor for the problem of trying to achieve excellence and, you could say, access at the same time.
Yeah, it's amazing how the power of this change until nowadays, and how they are trying in Australia to rebuild medical education, at least partly, to meet those needs. But maybe others want to come in to the discussion.
It looked like Justin perhaps had something to say on that. I don't know.
I'm also interested in what Justin has to say. Justin, please.
Oh, okay, thank you. I wanted to come back to important point that you make, Emily, which is that when we're comparing Germany and the U.S., you speak of belated errors. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the fact that even if the University of Berlin could in some senses be considered a national university, the really influential universities were not located in capital cities. So Göttingen is a town, Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore, although when Angela Merkel got her honorary degree last week, of course, it was at the Washington campus. Could you say a bit more about the unique environment that federalist systems with a lot of interstate or that's a unique kind of competitive environment. And what impact that you saw in your research did that have? I hope you heard my question.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that the issue of where the universities is located and the federalism is an extremely important explanatory mechanism for me in my work. And here I'm very influenced by the work that W.E.B did on decentralization and sort of the way that the competition and the devolution and the competition of regional centers creates a robust competitive system that is conducive and to educational excellence. And I think one of the things that I show is that this is in large part what Germany and America share in the 19th century. In different ways, they both have devolved political power, and there's conversations happening about how power should be organized. And then soon in the middle of the 19th century, in both places, you have conversations about how infrastructure should be organized and how education should be organized, and whether it should also be devolved or whether it should in fact be top down or centralizing. So, in contrast to France and Great Britain, which are the other places to which they're looking for models, that decentralization persists. And while it poses challenges, we might say, for infrastructure or trade, politics, it proves to be one of the key conditions for the possibility, I think, of academic excellence. And that's definitely one of the lessons of the story. Although, of course, America and Germany are not similar in how they approach those, they diverge in their solutions to those. And that's one of the interesting things too.
Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, and again, not so much from the history of the institutional innovation and the relations between those two centers. Germany, after the Second World War, did not come back to its glorious day academically. I wish, they made impressive move forward, but they do not invest to the same extent, and it seems that they are not really trying to compete with the US, at least in the social sciences and in the humanities. It didn't come kind of a social broad mission to renew and to lead. There are efforts in the European level, but I don't think this is not Germany before the Second World War, academically, I mean, and or before the rise of Nazis. And I wonder to what extent you think, from your historical perspective, innovation and excellence and leadership comes not only from discoveries in science or excellent books, but also from institutional innovations. And I mentioned one institutional innovation that I'm missing in the landscape of Europe, the graduate schools, the American style graduate school, but also the professorship, the associate professor, the assistant professor, the tenure, and so on, that we don't see to the same extent in Germany, especially in Germany. So here is my agenda. And you to comment on that. If you can, you can work.
That's a big set of questions. I mean, I think the one you've now mentioned a couple of times is this, I think I would call this sort of pathway towards professional, professional degree and sort of professional fulfillment. And I mean, what's interesting is that when Carnegie funded a study in 1907 to study, you know, these pathways, they looked to Germany, as we were saying, with regard to the medical profession, for these pathways. These pathways were there, right? The German professors were paid much more than the American professors were. And this was something, you know, in particular that they wanted to remedy. If they were going to get talent in the academy, they needed to kind of also have the kinds of pathways you're talking about. But they did note that, you know, it was very unequal, right? And that there was this kind of competition in the German system. And while the German professors who kind of made it were treated really well, those who were junior did not. Of course, Max Weber wrote about this very famously, right? And, you know, and he says, and of course, if you're a Jew, give up all hope, right? He says in that famous essay on Wissenschaft as a vocation, as a beruf. So I think, you know, I think there's clearly, we're at a breaking point. There's work to be done to, I think, create a new pathway for what it means to be a Wissenschaft as a beruf, right? To have vocation, to have scholarship as one's profession. And we've seen some of those incremental innovations that you've mentioned in Germany, you know, starting to implement the associate professor, the assistant professor, trying to create those inroads. And I think it's very difficult when they're done halfway and when they're grafted on to these institutions. So, you know, I think perhaps what we need is something bolder. You know, I think, as I was saying before, on my hopeful note, I hope that this shock to the system that we've experienced in this last year and a half will create those opportunities for those bolder innovations.
Thank you very much. I agree completely. And just to summarize, what's on your agenda now? The book is being completed for few months now, probably maybe a year, if just to make a calculated guess. And what's next for you?
Well, I'm getting used to my new position at the Stanford Graduate School of Education and building up a repertoire of classes to train future scholars and future teachers in the history of higher education. And in particular, I'm also returning to my roots in the liberal arts. And I'm both helping to revise the liberal arts requirement for first-year students at Stanford, as well as to write a new history of the liberal arts. And that will be my next book.
Well, fascinating. I know of Ramirez in your school in Stanford. I know that it's full with excellent.
Wonderful, many sociologists and social scientists with whom I have now the privilege of learning and from whom I can learn.
It's really fascinating, this combination of humanities and the social sciences that you have in this specific school. And it will be great to be there someday. I was in Berkeley for my postdoc, made a great impact on my research. So I wish you good luck. And
thank you. And I hope to join you there soon too.
Thank you. You're most welcome.
Okay, be in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you,
Very
our
nice
pleasure.
to see you.
Thank you, Justin.
Thanks a lot, Emily.
Thank you. Good to meet you, Justin. Thank you.